Hello and welcome to the Everything is Black and White podcast. I'm Drew Musgrove and I'm joined by John Gibson. And we come to you this afternoon, this evening, whenever you may be listening to it, with a bit of a sad episode because unfortunately we are here to pay tribute to one of the finest goal scorers Newcastle United has ever seen. And that is John Tudor, who has sadly passed away aged 78 after a battle with dementia. John is here to pay tribute not to John as only a Newcastle United legend in the eyes of many, who had that wonderful partnership with Malcolm MacDonald, who scored 72 goals in 290 appearances, but also to a close personal friend, because John was very good friends with John Tudor. I think that's where we'll start, John. How are you feeling after the news of John's unfortunate passing?
Very, very sad, obviously, and a little bit relieved, if you like, because John's at peace now, and he'd had a rough old time in recent years. 2014, he suffered a heart attack, and then he got dementia, and he eventually, inevitably, went into a care home. It was so difficult for his lovely wife Anne, a lovely, lovely lady, who had, and there were so many problems over there because there isn't a national health service, so there was financial problems in his keep, etc., etc. And once the quality of life went, it was inevitable, and it was some sort of release. But I mean, he was such a wonderful, wonderful man, wonderful player, dear, dear friend to me, a very deep thinker about the game. I mean, a lot of people think that he was Tonto to the Lone Ranger with him in Supermac, but that's terribly unfair on John. And Supermac would always say that. Supermac said he was perhaps the most unselfish teammate that he'd ever had, in as much as he got great joy out of creating for Malcolm as he did out of scoring himself. And I first met him on the day he travelled up here to sign for Newcastle. He signed just before Supermac joined us, and he came up and he stayed in the county hotel by the central station there. And I went to have dinner with him on the night before he went up the ground the next day and actually signed the papers. And during the dinner, his chest puffed out because he was going to join such a great and big club as Newcastle United. And he told me, he said, I've been offered £85 a week, plus I get £25 in appearance money, and I get another bonus on the size of the crowd, and a third bonus if we're in the top five in the league. And he said, you know what, Gibbo, sometimes I can even earn as much as 200 quid a week. Can you can you imagine Alexander Isak saying that today? Um, but I mean, he was so thrilled, he was so pleased, and he was meaning that as a plus. He came up here, he found it tough early on, but he then, once Malcolm MacDonald come, and it was the old thing, can they play together like we had with Ferdinand and Shearer, or one plays the same game as the other? Not at all. Two centre forwards were the thing in those days that happened, and they went together like fish and chips. They were just absolutely perfect for each other, and he, he he said from that day onwards, him and I became firm, firm friends. Um, so much so that straight after the 1974 FA Cup final, which they both played against Liverpool, ironically, we're going to play a Wembley final against Liverpool very, very shortly again. We were lucky to get none that day. We lost 3 now, but we were brilliant in the games leading up to it. We got through every round away from home, and Supermax scored in every round away from home. And we only stayed in the competition because John got a diving header against Nottingham Forest up here. A game was sensationally won 5-3, but was wiped from the record books because of a crowd invasion. But I was going to the World Cup finals, as I did regularly then, the summer of '74, and for the Chronicle. And I took John with me to be my sidekick and to give his professional opinion on the whole of the World Cup. In '74, England didn't make the finals, which was quite amazing. Uh, Scotland did. So we rocked up in Frankfurt as our base, and John and I travelled all over Germany together to go to the Scottish games and then other games. And it was fascinating just to sit with him. It was fascinating to sit with him as a friend over breakfast and days off, but at matches, he concentrated totally on the great forwards, the world renowned forwards that were in the World Cup, because he was wanting to learn for himself on the way to play the game. And he was a revelation to listen to. And he wrote a book, his autobiography, King for a Day, King Tudor, for one day that Newcastle lit when he hit the glory trail. And he said in that he paid tribute to our friendship and also to the fact that our illuminating going to the World Cup was with the Chronicle. And I always shows how much I know. I always felt during the playing days that Tudor would make a great manager and that Supermac wouldn't. Wrong twice. John never become a manager, although he wanted to and would have done, but he spent the last couple of years as a player out of the country in Belgium. And once you're out of the mind of chairman in those days, out of sight, out of mind, he was forgotten about and he never got the job that and I think he would have been a very good manager. Supermac, I thought was far too much Jack the Lad to ever make a manager. And he made an excellent manager at Fulham after that. So it shows how you can be wrong. But John was just a great, great friend. We stayed friends. The wonderful thing, Andrew, is when you make friends during the time a player is actually playing for Newcastle United, the friendship can get very deep, as it did with Supermac, as it did with Bob Moncur, as it did with John Tudor, that you stay friends long after they stop playing and long after you can't be accused as of a hack of just being a friend because you might get a story. You're a friend for life. And every time he settled in America, and he coached kids out there and thoroughly enjoyed it and died in America, bless him, because he was still there. But every time he came over to Newcastle, we would meet up and go to the game together. And tragically, the last time he came over, um, and Anne brought him and took him to the match because he liked the atmosphere, etc. He couldn't initially remember who I was when I met him, and I was just, and then it suddenly dawned on him and got ever such a wide smile and a big, big hug, and that's the John I like to remember, not just the John who was devastating in the air, John who was better on the ground than most people give him credit for, John who was an unselfish footballer, but my companion at the World Cup, my guy that I had some fun nights with that we would laugh ourselves silly. He was a very, very infectious. When he smiled, he lit up a room. He just had that smile on his face. And he's one of the great players, well remembered at other clubs like Sheffield United and Coventry and Stoke City. But he played more matches for Newcastle than any other club. And I think he's well remembered here. Um, Hallelujah, John Tudor. John Tudor was at the time was what all the fans sung, and it used to roll down St James's Park, and it was very very special, and it was a very very special time, and I've lost a friend, and Geordies have lost a loyal servant.
Yeah, you did a lovely tribute to him on the Chronicle website, and one thing that stood out from that piece was that you mentioned more than once that he was a man without an ego. Do you want to just explain a
Yeah.
little bit more about that?
Totally, totally. He was exactly that. And I'm not against egos. I mean, my dearest friend, probably Supermac, had a huge ego and had every right to have an ego. He had more swagger than John Wayne. He was more bandy leg than John Wayne as well. But he had that swagger about him. So did Paul Gascoigne, so did several people. Alan Shearer knew what he was, and quite rightly so. But John Tudor was more of the Jackie Milburn sort. I don't mean in terms of football. John wasn't quick and he didn't score as many goals as War Jackie. But, genuinely surprised that he was loved. And rather appreciative if the standard he'd made, because he'd come to Newcastle and thought that was utopia and loved it there, and got as much satisfaction out of setting up goals for Malcolm MacDonald as he did the ones he scored himself. And he had a couple of great seasons, 72, 73. He scored 24 goals, 74, 75, 18 goals. Him and Supermac scored a pile of goals together. And where they were clever, Barraclough was out on the wing. He was blisteringly fast. He would get to the byline, and there was no messing about. There was no maxi in, out, shake it all about. He got it across first time, and he didn't put crosses in with snow on them. He drove them in either to the near post or the far post. And both our centre forwards peeled. Supermac went to one post, and Tudor went to the other post. Both good in the air, and they got a load of goals between them. But there was no ego about John. He didn't play the superstar card. He didn't play, you realise I'm a Newcastle United striker card. He just got on with his job. He was almost a journeyman that become a superstar and didn't realise he'd gone from a journeyman to a superstar. It never dawned on him, and he was all the better for that. I felt he was all the better for that.
What do you think was the difference in that 72, 73 season? Because as you said, he initially didn't get off to the best of starts. 70, 71, scored just 5 and 16, 71, 72, 11 and 48. But then, as you mentioned, the 3 years following that, he really seemed to find his form. So what do you think the difference was in that 72, 73 season, which, as you say, saw him hit 24 and 48?
Malcolm MacDonald was there. They were terrific as a pair. In those days, today, when we had the discussions when Alexander Isak first joined us and Callum Wilson was the Newcastle number 9 before all the injuries overtook him, and there was always this discussion, wasn't there? Could they play together? And Eddie never was very reluctant to play them together, and when he did, he'd only play them together with Isak as essentially left winger doing the Anthony Gordon job, and Wilson through the middle. He didn't believe in 2 centre forwards in harness. That used to be the way it was years ago. It'll come back, by the way. Every tactic comes back in football, goes out of fashion and comes back into fashion. In those days, you played 2 centre forwards together. You did years later when Shearer and Ferdinand played together and were absolutely magnificent. And when John was by himself, he would plough the furrow, he would take on the hard work, he would take on the donkey's work, but he had nobody to share the load. Supermac, blisteringly quick, which John wasn't. John, terribly unselfish and even better than Supermac in the air. They just dovetailed. They went together wonderfully as a partnership. And defenders didn't know which one to mark, And that made a big difference. When there was 2 centre-halves against just Tudor, then you knew exactly what you had to do. And there was 2 of you onto one. Once MacDonald was at his shoulder, they caused havoc together. And Malcolm MacDonald went on to say he had an awful lot of partners. He had Alan Gowling at Newcastle, who was his partner in 76 in the League Cup. He had Ronnie Redford and Frank Stapleton at Arsenal, and he had various partners with England. But he always said his best partner was John Tudor.
Which is a huge compliment. And I guess the fact, John, that he didn't have an ego, John Tudor, probably made it a little bit easier to play alongside Supermac. We talked there about Supermac saying this and that about John Tudor, but I often think about kind of John Tudor just accepting that Malcolm is this superstar and he likes the lights and he dazzles, he grabs the headlines, and John Tudor just going, fair enough, I know what I'm good at and it works for Malcolm. Malcolm works for me. And when you haven't got those 2 egos clashing, that's probably exactly why they scored a boatload of goals for each other or with each other.
Totally, Andrew. It's very necessary. You couldn't get 2 egos like Supermac playing together in partnership because you would need a football for each of them. I mean, that was the trouble when you had Merendina and Gaza. They both wanted the ball and wouldn't pass to the other one because they wanted the ball to play with. And while they got on as great friends, there was 2 egos in one room, and it's got to be a big lounge to take 2 egos of that size. And therefore, John was perfect for Malcolm, and Malcolm in turn was perfect for John. John knew his limitations, but he knew what he was good at. And he needed the help of Malcolm to see the best of John Tudor. And Malcolm needed somebody without an ego who was willing to set up the shots for him, because nobody was better than Malcolm MacDonald when it come to scoring goals. Nobody was more flamboyant. Nobody was more exciting. So they each give the other what they needed without resenting the other. And that was, and all great partnerships work that way. You very rarely, I mean, I couldn't have seen, and I'm just plucking this out of the air, I couldn't have seen Supermac and Rodney Marsh working, who occasionally had to work together with England. I couldn't see them at club level being in partnership, because they were both flamboyant, they both wanted the ball, they both wanted the headlines, etc., and one would have probably annoyed the other. This was a partnership made in heaven, and John was excellent at that. And you know what? He might have initially been undervalued by the Newcastle fans, and it wasn't for long, mind, because they realised what they had. But he was never underestimated by Malcolm MacDonald.
I guess someone coming in at the time that he did, it was probably a difficult period because obviously it was so close to Jackie Milburn's exploits, 15, 20
Yeah,
years
yeah.
later. It's still very fresh in the memory. You kind of maybe compare it to those strikers who initially followed Alan Shearer. You're always thinking about the man who set the bar and who those coming in can never quite reach it. So it was probably a difficult time for John to come in. I mean, he'd scored 33 in 70 plus games for Sheffield United, which isn't a record to be sniffed at, but it's not a prolific record, is it?
No,
But
no,
I guess he
no,
comes in
no.
with that responsibility on his shoulders, and maybe that's why it didn't quite work to begin with.
Yeah, and Harvey was very good at building sides, but as Eddie Howe's been building this current Newcastle United side, for example, I firmly believe that the side that's going to go to Wembley to play Liverpool in the Carabao Cup final is a lot better than the side 2 years ago that played Manchester United in the Carabao Cup final, because we've now got Isaac as a starter, not a sub. We've got Tonali, we've got Gordon, we've got Livramento and Hall. We're a much better side now. Joe Harvey built three sides at Newcastle United. The first one was the 65 promotion side. The second one was the 69 side that won the European Fairs Cup. And the third one was the 74 FA Cup final side. And really, we'd had as centre forward Wyn Davies, who was a flamboyant centre forward, not a big goal scorer, mind. Big Wyn never scored a pile of goals, but he terrified people in the air. And he had become a superstar in the 69 side. Then Wyn went off and played for the two Manchester clubs, and a new side had to be built, which culminated in the 74 FA Cup final. And the first part of the bricks was Tudor. It wasn't Supermac. It was Tudor who arrived just before Supermac. Well, that's like having Laurel without Hardy, or Morecambe without Wise. They're only half what they really can be, and therefore Tudor to start with looked not like the Carter's centre forward, but looked like the centre forward with all the weight of expectancy on his shoulders, little or no help. I'll plow on. And then all of a sudden, in struts this guy with a cigar and a bottle of champagne and bandy legs and flying hair and do 100 meters in 10 seconds. And all of a sudden, the two go together. Absolute. I mean, it was thought there might be oil in water. Not by Joe Harvey. He knew what he was doing, and it worked a treat. And all of a sudden, not only did Supermac blossom, but Tudor blossomed as well.
I think the biggest compliment I can pay John Tudor, because obviously I wasn't around when he was playing for Newcastle United, but
No,
out of all those strikers around that time, obviously Malcolm aside, you've mentioned them there, Wyn Davies and Ron McGarry, kind of before him in that promotion season. It was John Tudor that I'd been talked to about, by my grandparents or my dad, and this is the man. So I knew about kind of John Tudor more than I did the other strikers, and I think that kind of says a lot about his standing with Newcastle fans. Because even if you go beyond Supermac, Peter With, for example, had a tremendous season. I saw at Newcastle United, but it was still John Tudor that people were talking about all those years later. In terms of his best attributes. I mean, you've kind of already said it, and it's a big compliment. Fantastic in the air, better in the air than Malcolm McDonald. And yeah, he loved a header or two, didn't he? Did John?
Oh, I mean, McDonald was no slouch in the air, believe you me. But this guy was really powerful. Now, the ultimate guy that everybody thinks of in the air is Wyn Davies, because that's what his game was totally about. But Wyn caused chaos in the penalty areas, especially in the European competitions where the continental defenders didn't know how to handle a guy. They used to say to me, "Isn't this game called football? What's the big guy doing with the ball in the air all afternoon?" They just couldn't understand it and couldn't handle it. The difference was, while Davies caused chaos in the air, he would sometimes be on the goal line win when we got a corner, in swinging corner, and he would head it down to another player. Instead of heading it in the net, he would head it back onto the edge of the 6 yard box for somebody to finish. John Tudor was direct. When he got a header, he buried it. And that was his greatest strength. He was very intelligent in the runs he made. He had better feet than a lot of people give him credit for, but his great strength was in the air. An ironic thing about it all, we've lost so many players, football and Newcastle United, to dementia recently. We just in recent times have lost Tommy Cassidy, John McNamee, and now John Tudor, and John's wife, who was very aware of the problem and had talked to the McNamee family and especially to Jeff Astley's family, who set up a charity for footballers suffering from dementia. And Anne's going to carry that standard on for all John's gone and work very hard to produce answers in terms of dementia in footballers and the possibility of it being linked to heading the ball, because John was all about heading the ball. And Anne was going to carry on that work, and bless her for that. She's out in Minnesota still at this moment, and his funeral will take place out there. But whether she comes back home to England, she's got kids here. She's also got a son, Jonathan, who lives in Minnesota because he went and worked with his dad later in life. So goodness knows what the future holds. But whenever they talk about, whenever Anne or John, before he had dementia, talk about his clubs, he always talked about Newcastle United first and foremost. He always wore Newcastle United scarf. He used to sit at a British pub in Minnesota on match days when Newcastle were playing with Anne to watch the games live, and he had a black and white scarf on. And he used to sit watching the current Newcastle team live on the telly with a black and white scarf on in Minnesota with the Newcastle exiled Geordies. Wonderful. A Geordie till I die. An adopted one, maybe, but absolutely one.
He came back, as you mentioned earlier in the show, John, and was paraded on the pitch. I think it was 2019. And in the Chronicle article, you posted a picture as well of you two together, big smiles. I mean, obviously, he was suffering from dementia at that time, if I'm not mistaken. But I just imagine if you would hope he was aware. Obviously, he was on the pitch and he was waving, but you would hope he was aware of the love and the affection that was shown from the crowd that day.
I think he was. It got a hold of him much more later on, of course, and then he withdrew really from public life, if you like. But I mean, I met him that day, and Anne was always great at prompting him. This is John Gibson. You remember John? You went to Germany with him, and he covered the cup. Oh yes. Once he had a prompter, I mean, even this is Supermac. Remember your partnership with Supermac? Well, this is Super. And when he had that, it dawned on him, and that wonderful smile. If you've ever seen John smile, his face lights up. He's like a Billy Shabikin. He goes from just a face like all of us to being absolutely radiant. He's got the sort of smile where you can't help but smile yourself just looking at him. He made people happy because he looked so full of the joys when he smiled, and it was good that he did remember things then, and that was about the last time he was really here that we can talk about, and it got a lot less. He used to stay with a very good friend of mine, and Angie, and who was a good friend of both Anne and John, and lived down at the coast and has a table in the Moncur Suite at Newcastle United. She's a supporter to this day. And I mean, she's absolutely decimated by what's happened to John, as we all at Newmore. And indeed, a lot of Newcastle fans, it's been lovely to see on the end of the obit I did online, etc., etc. A lot of people writing in either saw him or their dads told them about him, and the tributes paid to John. And of course, the sad thing is that this dementia, is it linked directly to football, or is it something that any of us can suffer from as we get older? Probably both those things. But as I say, Newcastle have already lost in the last year Tommy Cass, McNamee, and now John Tudor, and bless him, Terry McDermott's in the early-ish stages of the same thing, and it's such a cruel. I mean, it's cruel to everybody. But I still close my eyes and remember Newcastle United stars the way they were in the pump, and I don't. And to me, they never come down from that. They're always on the pedestal. They're always what they are. They were Newcastle United stars to me, always in their 20s. They never get old, and because that's the way we remember them. And then when you see them struggling, you see how vulnerable people are, and illnesses like dementia is no respecter of status or fame or anything else. We are all hit with a sledgehammer, and it is an awful, awful, awful thing.
It certainly is, and hopefully, as the years go on, they may be able to find some sort of cure for
Well,
what is a horrendous illness. John, just to finish off, then, just describe to us how you will remember not only John Tudor, the Newcastle United striker, but John Tudor, your friend.
above all, like an electric light bulb that just lit up a room by just entering it. And that was enough. And if you could make him smile, and I always wanted to make him smile, so I always try to say something funny and see that face light up with an absolute beam. And I treasure that man is the dear friend as much as I treasure the man that scored all those goals for Newcastle United alongside of Supermac. He becomes such a close friend. It was lovely to see the other side of him, living with him for weeks in Germany at the World Cup of '74, going out for dinner every night with him. You get to know the real person in situations like that. When you live together 24/7 for 4 or 5 weeks on end, you get to know the real person. And you get together to go to that, and then you come home. And if you love the guy as much or more when you come home as you did before you went out, you've got a special person, because people can irritate each other living together in each other's pockets for that length of time and working together in that length of time. He was just a privilege to see him play for Newcastle United, but even more privilege to be allowed to be called a friend. And the greatest thing I've got is that in his autobiography, he wrote that when we met in the county that night before he signed for Newcastle and he revealed his 85 quid a week wages, he said to me, from that day, I considered John a friend. And that's a compliment. That'll do for me.
Certainly is. And we send our wishes, prayers, and thoughts to John's family and friends at this difficult time. For myself and John, we'll be back later in the week with the match preview ahead of Newcastle United's trip to Manchester City. But enjoy the rest of your Wednesday afternoon. And once again, we pass on our best and our thoughts to John Tudor's family and friends.